Bonjour, je suis Natacha Kozicki de ARRI. Je voulais juste vous prévenir que Utsi, malheureusement, ne parle pas français. Donc, sa conférence va être en anglais. Il va essayer de parler lentement. Et on ne va pas tout traduire parce que malheureusement, on n'a pas le temps. Mais il y aura un temps de questions-réponses. Donc, n'hésitez pas à poser des questions. Et là, je serai là avec lui pour éventuellement donner des réponses en français. Et puis aussi après, n'hésitez pas à aller le voir dans la zone démo pour lui poser des questions. Voilà. Et donc, je voulais juste rappeler que la HDR, ou en tout cas la dynamique, est quelque chose à laquelle ARRI tient depuis le tout début de ses expériences dans le numérique. Et c'est pour ça que ARRI n'a jamais voulu se laisser prendre que par la guerre de la définition, des pixels, pour avoir un équilibre dans l'image de tous les éléments qui font une image, dont la dynamique est un élément très important. Donc, Utsi va vous expliquer tout ça en anglais.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me today here. It's great to have an event like this and to talk about HDR. So I just need to, well done. Good. Oh, yeah. So my name is Utsi. I'm a colorist, and I've been working on HDR images now for a couple of years. We did a lot of HDR presentations on the exhibitions with images from our cameras. And we have a post-production facility in Munich where we have all kinds of different HDR post-production means as such that we produce HDR for television in any format. So we do HDR10, we do Dolby Vision Home, and we also have a Dolby Vision projector in a grading suite, so we can produce Dolby Vision cinema DCPs. And so we've been working a lot to make it all fluent, and so just to give you an idea what we'll be talking today about. So first there will be a short introduction to HDR, and then an overview. And then we will talk about HDR on set, because I think that's an important question we have to answer in the next couple of months or years to come. HDR in post-production and HDR in distribution. So the first thing for me is really HDR is now, and it's already here, and it's happening every day. I just looked in the internet, and this is from the EBU website from a couple of weeks ago, which really looks into HDR, and they screened Planet Earth 2, which is a film from the BBC in HDR. So this is for broadcast. Now this is from a week ago from the Mobile World Conference in Barcelona. And so we already have smartphones with HDR displays, and the same for tablets. So this is also from the Mobile World Conference. So the term HDR is being, we have it in televisions, we have it in cinema, but it's also introduced to our digital lives in the form of our telephones and tablets. So this is already here, and for me is always the question, why do we want actually HDR? What's so important? What's the difference? Is it necessary to spend money and energy to produce something? And for me, HDR is a little bit like 20 years ago there was photos and there were slides where you shot on reversal, and to get a proper reaction you screen slides and you got this. And for me, it is really true. I think, just projecting a slide on a wall, it made the image glow, and there was something to it that was different than looking at a photo which was printed on paper. And I think we had that in cinema on film in the old days, where we had means like Kodak Premiere print, which was higher dynamic range than the normal prints you would see in cinema. And when we moved to digital projection, we lost a lot of that. And I think it's time to get back to what we already had in those days. And it's really about telling a story. So this is a picture from the last shuttle start. And in this image, you know, there is a flame which lifts the space shuttle into space. And I just simulated a low contrast version of this image just to emphasize that actually the story in this image is about the flame, and we need to be able to show that. And I'm not saying that every image has flames in it, or that, you know, that we need to use HDR in every image, but there are occasions where you shoot in very bright environments where you actually want to see the actor's face and maybe see that the sky is not burned out and lost because we can't show it in low contrast. And you have situations where contrast changes quite dramatically. In this scene, the girl opens the curtain. So she's in a very dark room at first, and then she opens the curtains, and there's suddenly a lot of light coming into the room. So you have situations where the contrast is changing. You have something like sport events where you actually want to see the sun and the shadow at the same time, which we don't see. Like if we look at the FIFA World Cup, the broadcast on television, you always see one or the other. You see the sun side or you see the shadow, but you don't ever see both because they don't have HDR in broadcast. And you have things like self-illuminated objects. This is a concert, so these objects all are kind of like practical lights, and you have fireworks. And wouldn't it be great to see all of that on screen? But there is a lot of confusion at the moment. And just to show you, this is from the ASC Committee Progress Report 2016. That's the questions they're having at the moment. So you're not alone. Everyone is asking questions. What is an HDR image? How do we define it? And how can we standardize all of this? We at ARRI, we have a webpage, just as a quick note, where we talk about, you know, FAQs. So you will find answers there for your questions. We have a special one for high dynamic range. We just updated it in the last couple of days, so it's very recent information. So anything where I confuse you today, please go and have a look at the website, and it might give you a better answer. So an overview. We always believed at ARRI that it's very important to talk about an image at what makes the best overall image quality. And it's certain things which are important. And I think it's not always one aspect of it. Like a resolution is important, but for me, dynamic range is much more important than resolution. And we made a list of parameters where we also defined the way we, you know, what is the most important one. The first one was really the absence of artifacts. And then for us, the second one was already dynamic range. And then it goes on with color rendition, color gamut, noise level, bit depth, data rate, spatial resolution, temporal resolution. Now, the dynamic range is really the ratio between the darkest and the brightest part of the image. So it is the difference between the black here in the t-shirt and the white in the brightest point in the clouds. And there is different ways of measuring that. We have the means of defining a contrast ratio. This is often used by television manufacturers because they like big numbers, like 1,000,000 to 1. And you can describe it as decibels, which is used in sound. And in digital photography, we use stops. So stops is really a way to describe an amount of light. And it's really simple because one stop increase will double the amount of light, and one stop decrease is really half the light than you had before. And you can actually see it to the contrast ratio. So this is half the value than the one underneath. And there's a third term I will teach you today. It's candela per square meter, or nits. So this is from the Latin, niter, to shine. This is a means to define a brightness. And this is what people put on their TVs, saying, well, my TV can do 1,000 nits or 4,000 nits. But this is only in HDR terms half the story, because it's only the brightest point on that TV. What's really important is as well is the contrast. So there are, for instance, there are LCD TVs which can do 1,400 nits, but they have a very bad black point. So they're not really good HDR TVs. And for instance, this is an OLED TV I brought with me today. This only does 600 nits, but it has an absolute astonishing black point, and that makes it a good HDR display. So very important to know the contrast of a device, not only the brightest point, what it can do. I will go over this briefly because it's, but it has to do with HDR as well. Basically, with the introduction of the new TV formats, moving to UHD, there are new color spaces. In the old days, we had Rec 709, which is the color space for HD TV images. We have P3 for a long time, which is the color space we use for mastering for cinema. And now new is Rec 2020, which is a bigger color space even than P3, which will be the color space for all UHD TV signals. And so HDR as well, even being independent from color spaces, at the moment, everything which is produced for HDR is in Rec 2020 color space. And there's also the term of white color gamut, and it's really those two, DCI P3 and Rec 2020, which are the white color gamuts. Now, this is the last technical term I will teach you today. It's, but it's the most difficult one. Basically, if you have a scene like the guy standing at the window and you want to reproduce that on a TV, you have two curves. It's the OETF and the EOTF. Now, I'm only going to talk about the EOTF because that is changing in an HDR world. Now, the EOTF is basically you have an image on your hard disk or on something on your server, and you want to display it on a screen. And now in the old days, we used something which was called gamma, and an HD TV has a gamma of 2.4. And moving to HDR, people found that a gamma curve is actually not very sufficient because you don't have enough detail in the blacks where you really need it in HDR. And you have a lot of information in the highlights where you actually don't. So it is not an optimal curve. So there's two new curves which people came up with, and I will be using these terms along my presentation. So there's the PQ, perceptual quantizer. This was developed by Dolby and is already as a SMPTE standard. So it's an open standard and people can use it without Dolby. And there's hybrid log gamma, which was developed by the BBC and the NHK. And this was really when the BBC thought of hybrid log gamma, it was really for live broadcasting, where the PQ curve was really introduced for mastered content on Blu-ray disc or over-the-top streaming, but not for live. But both can do anything, you know, there's no limit, and I will talk about that as well. But it's just very important that this is something new with HDR. So we are moving away from gamma curves, and we have now 2 new curves we need to understand. Now, actually, in the old days, before 2015, it was very simple. You had a camera and you would record a high dynamic range image. In this case, we use an Alexa. We have 14 plus stops in the Alexa. And then we bring this image to the cinema and the home. And those devices actually have a very low contrast ratio. In the cinema, 11 stops is actually pushing it a little bit, and 8 stops at home. So this is what, so you had more information in the camera, and you would put that in cinema and at home. Very easy. Now in 2015, a lot of things changed. First of all, people built new TVs like these OLED TVs, which have an amazing contrast ratio. And so also in cinema, there were new laser projectors which could do a higher contrast than before. And the standards for delivering images were introduced. So we had suddenly the possibility to do HDR. Now, after 2015, it is actually a little different now that we have now devices which can do high dynamic range. So the amount of deliverables we have to do is a lot more now, and it is a little bit complicated, but I will try to make it as easy as possible. But to first get you started, I brought some images with me, and we will look at a clip. This is This is a Nike commercial. It was shot in India by a French DOP, Matthias Boucard, and it was post-produced in France. And we actually took a master they finished for standard dynamic range, and we converted it to HDR, now played on this OLED TV. So great images to show in HDR because they're very vibrant and they have a lot of dynamic range in them from the source. And I think it's great to show HDR, you know, with a clip like this. But this has a certain look, and I think people most often think HDR needs to look like that. It needs to be colorful and high contrasty. And in my opinion, that's not true. I think HDR is actually means to create new looks and even, you know, do something which we haven't done before, but we can do exactly what we did before as well. And I just want to emphasize that, you know, HDR doesn't need to be colorful. It doesn't need to be high contrast. And I will have an example for that. And I think there's also a problem that we shoot for SDR, and then we take a product and we just blow it up to something else, which it was never meant to be. And I think that's very dangerous, because when the image was shot, nobody thought about, well, this could become HDR in the end, and it will maybe change ratios between skin tones and practicals and lights in the image. And so I think we have to be aware that HDR is great, but we have to also think about the level we use it, and that we don't, like in audio, when the commercial break comes up, it's 6 dB louder than everything else, and it's annoying. So I think it's great to look at images like that, but I think HDR doesn't have to be like that for everything. Now, HDR, what's great, I can take a small TV and anybody across the room can see that it's has this vibrant colors. There's, you know, you don't have to be at a certain distance of the TV to see the resolution or so. It's apparent, you know, it's really a striking image, and it gives you more depth in the image. The images look sharper, they look more vibrant. And so it's a great experience. And if you walk into a Best Buy, or I don't know, the French electronic store, MediaMarkt maybe, or Saturn, something like that. I don't know. LG will have a corner with their OLED TVs, and people are drawn to it just because of showing HDR, because it's different, and you walk into the store and you immediately see, well, this is something which I haven't seen before. And yeah, so the difference is really striking, and it's really apparent. Now, back to my statement in the beginning, HDR is now. So what we have at the moment is we have HDR in cinema with Dolby Vision cinemas across the world. There's about 80 cinemas at the moment, most of them in the US and China. We have a few in Europe, a handful, I must admit. There's Eclair Color cinemas. I think there's around 20 cinemas at the moment, and it's growing rapidly. So 2 different systems. We have HDR at home. We have TVs, Blu-rays, streaming services which already do HDR. So Netflix, Vudu, YouTube, Amazon. So you can actually stream HDR via YouTube already since a couple of months. And we have HDR on cell phones and computers. And there's more to come. I mean, Apple will introduce something probably this or next year with HDR. And so this is a big topic. I actually took a forecast from the internet, from IHS, where they predict how many HDR TVs will be sold in the next couple of years. And we're at a stage where we say about 40 to 50% of all new TVs will be HDR capable. This is this year. In 2 years, 2019, every new TV being sold will have HDR capabilities. So this is 24 months from now. So very fast moving. Let's look at Amazon. Amazon was the first to offer HDR streaming. They've been doing it since 2015. One of their first show was Mozart in the Jungle. Now they have 6 shows which are shot on Alexa or Amira, which are broadcast over the top in HDR. They actually prefer at the moment to record ProRes 3.2K and say, well, this is less data we have to care about in the recording stage, in the post, and then we blow it up to 4K at the end. For a case study, I actually brought a small clip from Grand Tour with me. So this was shot on Amiras mainly. They used ProRes 422HQ, which is really the lowest codec I would use for HDR. I think we have to move higher, at least to ProRes 4x4, which is 12-bit. And they posted for HDR first, and then they did a trim pass for SDR. So let's have a look on the TV what that looks like. It's gonna stay like that. So completely over the top. They actually do advertise HDR. You can see that 24 frames has a limit in Hdr, and there's actually, the image looks in some ways already very digital because it gets this great dynamic range. But people love it, like they've been broadcasting their show since the beginning in HDR, and they had reviews where people, normal critics would actually say the image looks different, and they don't know why or what's happening, but they like what they see. So, good example. So, HDR on set. So, from our side, for our digital cameras, with the introduction of HDR, we didn't change anything in our cameras. So when HDR for home and cinema came around, we didn't need a new recording format or a new menu where it says HDR recording. We still do exactly the same, because when we introduced the Alexa in 2010, it already captured HDR images. And all of them captured in log C and ARRI RAW were HDR capable. And that has to do with the way we designed the sensor, because we believed in having a very good pixel, and that meant that pixel needed to have a certain size on the sensor, and that way we could capture more dynamic range than any other camera. And this is still true until today. There's no other sensor which can capture the same dynamic range than the Alexa. Now, what we did then is that every camera we built from after the Alexa has exactly the same pixel. So even the Alexa 65 has the same pixel, it just has more of them. But it has the same dynamic range, and you will have it in the Amira, in the Mini. So all of them are very HDR capable. They're actually the best source for HDR. And to show that, for IBC last year, we looked into our archives and we tried to find old images from the Alexa, from the Mini, from the Amira, and we got the original negative or camera files back online and regraded them for HDR, for television, for Dolby Vision cinema. And I will have a small clip of that now here on the TV. So I really like that the flowers at the end, because it really gives you something realistic about this flowers, which I haven't seen in SDR before. So I think there is something to do the way you can display light again in HDR, which is new. And for me, you know, I've been playing in a sandbox, I would say, in grading, and the sandbox just got really, really big, and it's a lot of fun because there's new things we can display which were not capable, we weren't able to do before. This is a good question, HDR monitoring on set, and it's been overlooked by all productions, I'd say. I think there's only a handful of productions which really use an HDR monitor on set, I think, but this is a crucial point which we have to do it. We have to start looking at images the way they will be produced in the end. If we only look at standard dynamic range monitors, we're only seeing half the image. And we will have problems later on with things which weren't apparent because they don't show up on a standard dynamic range. So it's a very important point, and it is not that I want to change all monitors to set, it's just one, and it needs to be one monitor on set. There's a few options here that the numbers are growing daily, but is very limited at the moment. But it's a very important point, because a DOP who actually knows he's going to shoot for HDR, he can then look at his image on an HDR monitor and make decisions, creative decisions, which will make a better HDR image and also make a better SDR image. We provide for our cameras, just on a side note, we have look files which make all our cameras HDR capable, so they will output an HDR image which you then directly can display on an HDR TV or monitor. These can also be found in this FAQ section I pointed out earlier. Now, practical tips. This is what should you consider when shooting for HDR. The first is don't clip, but it's very difficult because you shouldn't clip the highlights and the lowlights. The highlights is very difficult. If you have clipped skies, they look awful in HDR. They can look okay in SDR, but in HDR, they look really, really bad. So this is something really to consider. Look at the sky, try not to clip, but also, of course, you will see into the blacks and you will see noise. So also try to get a camera which has a very low noise level, because it will show in HDR in a way you haven't seen in SDR before. And here just more practical tips. So as I just mentioned, noise becomes more apparent. You will see into shadows and highlights like you haven't on an SDR monitor, and it will actually accentuate windows or practical lights, and this can actually be really distracting. Like if you think you have a lady in the image with some jewelry and there's a glare on the jewelry, which will actually distract you from the face, and you will start looking at jewelry just because there's a bright spot on that rather than looking at the face. So this is just some practical advice we found. But also makeup becomes more apparent, things like that. And things like backdrops actually can look strange in HDR, and you can see that they're fake and maybe not the real world. And so to avoid problems like that, look at an HDR image very early on. And also judder is becoming more apparent. As you increase contrast and brightness, judder is basically the motion between images where your eye is not capable to smooth out between two images anymore. And this is actually a big problem because 24 frames has already judder in cinema. And if we go high dynamic range, we will have more judder. So we have to think how we will grade images early on, and we already have to think about that on set, because it really changes the way we do maybe a dolly movement. Maybe a dolly movement can be too fast in high dynamic range, but it looks okay in SDR. Just to show you quickly, I've brought it with me a small clip, and this is a very technical clip. It's basically a rectangle moving across the screen. And the rectangle moves always at the same speed. It's 20 pixels per frame. And the rectangle is always 10 times as bright as the background. But we will look at it at different light levels, and it's very interesting what happens. Just things to consider. And I think that with HDR, we also have to talk about higher frame rate, in a sense that we will need new ways to show 24 frames. I'm not saying that we should move everything to 60 frames or something. That I don't believe in that. I think that doesn't work. I think we need 24 frames as a basis for cinema, but I think there are ways to make judder not so apparent today. So there's something called creative shutter, which basically plays with the way we emulate shutter, the shutter in the camera over a certain amount of images. There's also the possibility of local frame rate, which there's been people been doing tests. So local frame rate is basically saying you have a background, for instance, which plays at 24 frames, but you have an actor, a fast-moving actor, and he will move at 120 frames. And so the image will still look like 24 frames, but you will be able to see fast motion in the actor, and you will actually be able to look at in his face and recognize him if it's, let's say, a dancer or a martial artist. So there are things, and we have to consider all of these, because judder, I think, is a big problem, and we don't want to look at juddery images in the cinema or at home. HDR in post-production. So back to the standards. At the moment for home, we have Dolby Vision. There will be a presentation about this later on, so I will just go quicker. There's HDR10. This was defined by the UHD Alliance. There's a lot of members from the industry and from the studios. Actually, ARRI is also a member of the UHD Alliance. And they came up with this open standard, so that it's not proprietary hardware, or there's no licensing in this way of delivering images to the home. There's already Ultra Blu-rays since, I guess, 7 or 8 months. So you can already buy Ultra Blu-ray discs in HDR. in the HDR10 format. And there are players from many manufacturers which can play those discs. And of course, HDR10 is also used for broadcasting over the top. So Amazon is using HDR10. Netflix is actually using both. So Netflix has some shows in Dolby Vision and has some shows in HDR10. And then there's the third one, the hybrid log gamma from the BBC and NHK. And this is also an open standard, no licensing fees. Just to put it in perspective, I made this chart. So to understand, they all use the same color space. HDR10 and Dolby Vision use the PQ curve, and hybrid log gamma, of course, uses their hybrid log gamma curve. The difference between HDR10 and Dolby Vision is really Dolby Vision has this dynamic metadata, which a colorist actually creates while grading. And with that information, Dolby can down and upscale to any brightness. They can do that in HDR, but they can also take an HDR image and make an SDR image out of that. In HDR10, you don't have those capabilities. You grade for a certain brightness level, at the moment for 1000 nits, and then you will create a second master, an SDR master, and you will do something like dual casting, which is easy for Amazon to do because it will know what the capable of via the app you're using. And then, so SDR TV compatibility is no in HDR10, but it doesn't matter because you just create your SDR master. Dolby Vision can do that in one master, and hybrid log gamma can do that as well, but the SDR image often doesn't look as good as it could look doing it this way, because it is actually the way they designed the curve. The good thing about hybrid log gamma is that it will play on any old TV the same way it will play on an HDR TV, and it's just one stream. So moving to cinema, Dolby Cinema, Dolby came up with this concept a few years ago, and they really tried to change the way a cinema looks and feels. And they did that not only changing the projectors and the sound system, but they also thought of a completely new design of a cinema. So they thought about what the seating should be. They did. They of course only have black seats to get the best dynamic range. They have this blue lighting. They have a signature entrance with projection wall where you can see clips from the film you're going to see in a minute to introduce you to what you're going to see. So there's certain aspects of it, how they build the cinema, and then it becomes a Dolby cinema. They also have things like a floating screen. They have, of course, every Dolby cinema has a Dolby Atmos sound system. The sound system needs to be designed that no speaker is visible in the room, so that you as an audience don't know where the sound comes from. So it gives you really the feeling of 3D sound. And they use their own laser projection, which have a contrast ratio of 1,000,000 to 1. So, yes. This is just, so we have a Dolby Vision grading cinema in Munich. What's unique about this, we have that actually next to a Dolby Atmos mixing stage. So when you do your film in Atmos and Vision, you can do it in 2 rooms in parallel at the same time, and you have a director only needing to move 10 meters. Then there's Eclair Color. They use a Sony digital cinema projector, a 4K one, which has a contrast ratio of 8,000 to 1 with a special Eclair Color software. And they also project at double the brightness as does Dolby Vision, 30-foot Lamberts. And there will be more information about that, so I don't need to cover. We're still in the post-production side, so I often get asked, how can I do HDR with ACES? And of course, the answer is yes. Everything you want to produce with HDR can be done in ACES. HDR editing and also is nearly as important as the aspect of having an HDR monitor on set. I think there's a value in editing in HDR, and it can be done today easily by just creating editing files in PQ curve and using a PQ monitor. And that way you already can edit in HDR and make decisions while watching an HDR image. Now, how should you go about post-production? This is, should you first grade for SDR and then do an HDR trim pass? Or should you first grade HDR and then do a trim pass for SDR? There's no golden rule at the moment. People do it both ways. Just because SDR is still the main master and HDR will only be viewed by maybe 3% of the audience and at home or in cinema. So people say the SDR is really important and we want the best, so we will do that first. Now, I don't believe that should be the way we move into the future. I think there is much more value in grading HDR first and then going to SDR. You will do a better grade in HDR. It will be matched better than in SDR, and it will also be quicker because you don't have to do as many windows in HDR because you have more contrast range and you don't need to bring every sky down, and you don't, there's a lot of things you don't have to care about, so it will make things faster. But there's the danger client will fall in love with HDR and hate SDR afterwards. So we had people who said, well, we love the HDR. Now just make the SDR look the same, which is kind of difficult, but it will take a few years, I guess, until that is settled. But also don't go crazy in the HDR. And just to, I think this is what I mentioned before, there's a danger just to making it too contrasty and too colorful. And to show you, I brought a clip. This is from a feature starring Emma Watson, Colonia, and Dinidad. And we actually took a SDR graded file and up-converted it to HDR. This was shot on an Alexa, and there was analog grain added to the image in that process of grading for the SDR cinema. Now, people were very scared that that is going to be too apparent in HDR and it's going to look ugly, and the HDR anyway is not going to look very nice, and we're going to lose the way the image looks, that film look. So this was also graded with a very strong film look applied. And actually the DOP loved what he saw in HDR, and he says it improves the image, but it doesn't break it in any way he thought it would. But I think, you know, for me, this shows HDR can look great and the creatives can be happy about it. And I think it's very important to have those creatives, the DOP and the colorist, in the room when doing HDR. I don't believe that we just do some process at the end and turn a finished film into HDR and do something where the creatives don't feel they have control over. I think we need to give control to the DOPs and the colorists to really do proper HDR. And the studios actually see it more like 3D conversion, that you just finish the 2D version and give it to me, and then I'll do my 3D version out of it. And I think that's not the proper way to do it. Ah, wrong remote. Huh. Okay. So this is an example of you have an SDR master and you can turn it into an HDR master. It's not the best way to do it. It's possible. There are systems which can do it today. So there's ColorFront, Filmline, Technicolor, DaVinci Resolve. They all have tools for doing that. Best is always to go back to the original camera files. And the laptop died, I think. Or am I too, I need to finish, I guess. Okay, HD delivery to home. So you have streaming. We use Havoc files for that, H.265. This is actually what we do on the TV. We're playing back Havoc files. They're 35 Mbits, so they're in a range where you could actually put them on the internet and stream them. They're 4K clips. Netflix and Amazon are streaming about 15 megabits at the moment. Ultra Blu-ray can play up to 100, so these files are 35, so they're right in the middle. Of course, the Ultra HD Blu-rays are out there. They all have HDR logo in front, and what they do with HDR10, they actually put 2 discs in there. They will put an Ultra HD HDR disc in there and also have an HD TV version. So if something goes wrong and you bought the wrong cable or the wrong player or the wrong TV, you can still see an image. And hybrid log gamma, of course, exists, but there's no channel. BBC is generating a lot of content in hybrid log gamma, but it's not being broadcast at the moment. There's been tests done by Sky in Germany, in the UK, and in Canada, and it will come soon, but it's not here yet. Delivery to cinemas, as mentioned, Dolby Cinema and Eclair Color. And to finish up, I have a short trailer which we've actually posted in ARRI Media in Munich, where I actually also did the creative on all of that, just to show what is actually possible with LED lighting today. So enjoy. We will be showing all of these clips again outside in the demo area on the TV. So if you want to have a closer look, I know some of you might be sitting far away from the TV, so we'll play them again. But that's it from my side. Thank you.